Thank you, and welcome everybody to this month's Connect with Remedy monthly webinar series. Today we're going to present on Smart IT performance considerations. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you can ask them via the Q&A pod, and our panelists will be able to address those questions during the presentation. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Seema Kaul, our presenter today.
Thank you, Greg. This is Seema Kaul, Principal Product Developer with BMC Software. I have been with BMC for many years, worked on lots of ITSM applications for many years. Currently, I am working on Smart IT and mainly engaged with solving customer issues. Of late, I've been engaged with a lot of customers solving their performance issues, hence this webinar and to share some of the experiences. Agenda for today, talk about performance use cases, the common performance use cases that are sensitive to performance issues in Smart IT, discuss the Smart IT environment configurations to help with that are important for performance, SQL tuning for long-running queries, database tuning. Then we put together some reference links that can help you, tune your environment better, and finally summary and Q&A. Performance use cases. Global search. Global search is one of the common functionalities used in Smart IT. It is used for searching all types of tickets, knowledge articles, assets, people. So the screenshot here shows you how to access global search. For most of the folks that are familiar with Smart IT, they should be quite familiar with this. So when you type in, when you launch click the search field, you will see a field where you can type in a string that you're searching for. When you type in a string, it returns tickets, which are all types of tickets, change requests, incidents, work orders, service requests, and it also returns knowledge articles, it'll return people, and it'll return assets. For tickets and knowledge articles, the full text search capability of AR system is used, which is referred to as, in short, FTS. So it is important that FTS is configured and configured properly for these types of tickets and knowledge articles to return. Unlike ITSM, Smart IT is a lot more dependent on FTS. There's a lot of core functionalities in Smart IT that utilizes FTS. So, we need to ensure FTS is configured well. You can access the FTS tab on the AR Server Administration Console System, General Server Information FTS, and make sure FTS is enabled. FTS server performance should be good. FTS fortification should be done if needed. There's a very good article on the communities on how to do the FTS fortification in case you have, like, for example, additional fields that are set up with FTS and which are not needed, redundant fields. So you can drop those if you're not, those are not being used. As I said, global search returns tickets, knowledge articles, but it also returns assets and people. For assets and people, we use AR API, so it does not rely on FTS. So people, usually we haven't had many issues in terms of performance. People data is returned quite fast. Assets can cause performance issues if the asset area is not tuned and configured as recommended. And this is especially more obvious when you have a large CMDB. So when under the covers, when you launch the global search, so one part of the search returns the assets. So when the asset search is made, it searches against AST-based element, which is an ITSM form, and it searches against the fields name, serial number, model, tag number, CIID. So those are 5 fields that get searched against that string by default. In a lot of organizations, people do not use tag number and CIID. So if you're not using tag number and CIID, we recommend to turn it off. There's a configuration in the Smart IT database. There's a flag called is_exclude _tag and CIID. So what it does is, if you set it to true, then searching on tag number and CIID will not be made. You will only search the string against name, serial number, and model. This has also been proven in our performance lab to work faster. So because tag number and CIID come from a different table. So AST-based element, for those of you who are familiar with CMDB and asset management, is the join between core base element and AST attributes form. So name, serial number, model come from the base element, tag number and CIID come from AST attributes. So under the cover, database has to only get data from one part of the join, and it's much faster. So I would recommend make sure to turn this flag, set this flag to true if you're not searching on tag number and CIID, and this will vastly improve the performance. Another flag in the database, in the Smart ID database that we have, is leading search for asset. This flag is set to true, and that is how it should be for better performance. So what it does is, when you type in a string, it puts in a %, which is a wildcard, at the end of the string. So if you type in Optiplex, it'll search for name like Optiplex %, which in that case, index will be utilized. However, if you go and switch this flag to false, this can impact performance because there would be a % stuck in the beginning. So it'll be %Optiplex %, and in that case, the index may not get utilized. So both these flags, the exclude flag for tag number CIID and the leading search for asset flag, both can be found in the Smart IT database. A couple other things to consider for better asset performance is review the join criteria on the AST-based element. By default, there is the qualification is reconciliation ID equal to reconciliation ID, or reconciliation ID equal to instance ID. The or part of the qualification can be eliminated or removed if you do not care to return unreconciled assets. So this causes performance degradation. This has actually been fixed in one of the hot fixes in ITSM for performance benefits. If you're using the latest hot fix or patch, you probably already have it in place. But if you're experiencing slowness in retrieving asset records, review this qualification. As I said, when we search for assets, we make a search on the AST-based element, and we search on the serial number, model, name by default if tag number and CIID are turned off. So this is the qualification, how it looks like. So we need to make sure the fields that are part of the where clause. So if you have tag number and CIID turned off, then you'll only see 3 fields here in the where. If you have the part that is highlighted in red, but if you have all of them enabled, then you'll have the 5 as I've shown it here. So you need to make sure you have individual indexes on these fields. So for example, you should have an individual index on serial number, you should have an individual index on model number, you should have an individual index on name, and you should also have a composite index comprising of company, class ID, and dataset ID. And those are also a part of the qualification. I've truncated the qualification here, but this is recommended for the qualification to work better. So another common use case is the asset details. So we've noticed in some customer instances, opening asset details was slow. So when you open asset details, we also load various relationships for the assets. So one of the relationships in certain cases we've noticed taking time is the asset-to-asset relationship. So you need to make sure we have the following index on the base relationship table. Source reconciliation ID and destination reconciliation ID, those indexes are in place. For most cases, they should be there out of the box, but we've noticed a few instances where one of them was missing, and once we added the right indexes, the asset details loaded pretty fast. Ticket console. Ticket console is another important and very commonly used use case in Smart IT. And this use case is prone to performance issues if things are not tuned well. So to understand it a little better, Ticket Console is equivalent of your overview console in ITSM. For those of you who are familiar with ITSM, it shows data from all types of tickets. So when you launch into the ticket console, it's the console for the agent. He can see all the tickets assigned to him or his group. There are two default filters out of the box that show you the data. So to understand how the data comes in, we have a union view in the database which joins the individual views on top of various ticket types. In Smart IT, we've created a view form which is called share union overview underscore master console. This view form points to this union view, and Smart IT fetches the data via this union, the view form. For performance considerations, like any other query, indexes on all the underlying tables should be reviewed. Indexes for this console are documented on our documentation website. So we need to make sure that those are actually in place. Because if the right indexes are not in place, it can take time for the queries to load. And it is especially more obvious as your data keeps growing. Initially, if you're starting with a clean database, it might appear fast, but as the number of tickets grow, the ticket console can take time to load the data if you don't have the right indexes in place. The ticket console also gives you capability to add additional filters. Out of the box, we have show me my tickets assigned to me or tickets assigned to my group. So these additional filters allow you to create additional qualifications, and depending upon the type of filters you use, they could be utilizing some out-of-the-box indexes that are already in place. However, if certain queries are not working well, are not returning data in a timely fashion, then you should review the query and make sure you have the indexes in place. Smart Recorder. Smart Recorder is another use case. It's a primary interface for recording your ticket. So whenever you want to create an incident or a work order or even a service request, if an agent is creating a service request, you would use the Smart Recorder interface. While recording this ticket, Smart Recorder brings up user info, asset info, open resolved tickets for the user, similar tickets, relevant articles, etc. So it brings in a lot of data in context to the user that you typed or in context to the problem you entered that the user is facing. So there's a lot of things happening on the Smart Recorder as you try to record the ticket. If some of the areas or some of the components of the application are not tuned well, that search can take time. So, so you need to pay attention to, okay, you need to understand what all is happening, and if certain area is not well, maybe look at tuning that. Here's a screenshot of a Smart Recorder for folks who haven't had a chance to look at it yet. So, so you type in the username, which is the Bob Baxter, has email issue. So you'll say @Bob Baxter has email issue, and the Smart Recorder brings up all the relevant information for Bob Baxter. Bob Baxter is the customer, so you can see customer information. Further down the screen, you see Bob Baxter's assets that he's using. You'll see Bob Baxter's open and resolved tickets, and then as you typed, has email issue. So in context to that, on the right-hand side, you will see templates that could be utilized to record the ticket. You can also see knowledge articles that match the description of the problem. You'll also see similar tickets that you might be utilized to mark your ticket as a duplicate of that or get information from that. So all these smart searches are given to you to resolve the ticket faster. But the point here is to understand there's a lot happening here, right? There's a lot of searches happening. So you need to make sure everything is returning fast and understand how it works. So when you say add person, what it does is it goes and searches against CTM people form for first name, last name, login, full name, corporate ID, email ID. So Bob Baxter is searching against all these fields, and it's based on the matches in these fields, it returns the data. So for most part, there are indexes in place for these fields that we utilize for retrieving the data. However, if you're experiencing slowness, review these fields, review the indexes on CTM form, and see if there is anything missing. Open resolved tickets. So this is the user's open resolved ticket, which is also returned. In this case, the search is made against the same form that is used for the ticket console, which is the Share Union Overview Master Console. There have been instances, a lot of instances where this data is not returning in a timely fashion. So in most cases, the issue was related to the indexes. Once the indexes were added, the data returned faster. Again, these index recommendations for this is documented on the documentation website, and you can refer to that. Make sure you have the right indexes if you're experiencing slowness in this area. And we also return users' assets. Typically, it's been okay because it's just a small set of assets for the user. Resources on the right-hand side, in certain cases, have seen problems, and typically it's been an issue with some FTS configuration. Once the FTS is configured well, you will see templates, knowledge articles, and similar tickets returned. Another use case that comes up in the field is save and update tickets. Typically, we haven't really fixed anything or added any special indexes for save and update specifically, We've noticed save and update taking time, typically whenever the environment is overall not working well. So the environmental slowness will cause slowness of the save and update. So if you're experiencing slowness in this, so make sure you're reviewing the Smart IT environment and make sure it's all tuned well. You should also look at if there are any queries, long-running queries that users are making which are not tuned well, and review those to make them efficient, because that can impact the overall environment. There's also, at times, we've noticed there is this functionality. We'll talk about that in detail more as we further move along the presentation. There is the social component of Smart IT, which utilizes a form called Social Bridge, SHR:/SHR-CA_Social Bridge. It's similar to CAI events for those who are familiar with ITSM SRM. It's a temporary form used to transfer data from ITSM over to a social database, which is the Mongo Database. If things get stuck here, if the records get stuck here and not processed in a timely manner, the number of records in this form can grow and can contribute to the slowness greatly. So you need to pay attention to this form as well to make sure it is working well. So moving on, this slide gives you a high-level architecture of how Smart IT environment looks like. So if you see here, we have the Smart IT servers, which correspond with the AR ITSM. So Smart IT sits on top of AR ITSM, right? So we have the Smart IT servers, we have the AR ITSM servers, then we also have a component called Mongo Database where we store the social data. So that's another component of the Smart IT. We have the chat server, so chat can be installed on the same server as Smart IT, or you can have a separate server or a group of servers for chat. Then you can have an RSSO component. You also have the database. One database is under the AR ITSM. Then you also have a database that is directly connected to Smart IT. So there are two databases, one direct database under Smart IT, and one is the database under the AR ITSM. So, and then you have, of course, your clients that, which will be the web clients and the mobile clients that talk to Smart IT via the load balancer or without the load balancer, depending upon your environment. So this gives you a high-level picture of, okay, what all is there and where all the performance could go wrong, right? So when you look at the performance considerations, you need to review all of these environments to make sure they're all working well. So reviewing the AR server configuration. So when you're reviewing the AR server configuration, make sure to look at all the servers in this server group. When Smart IT talks to AR ITSM, the request can go to any of the servers in the server group. You need to make sure AR resources such as disk space, memory, etc. are all, there's enough of those for the request to get processed. Make sure there are enough threads configured on each of the servers. Make sure we have a JVM settings configured as recommended, which include JVM memory, garbage collection settings, verbose logging, etc. All of these settings for AR are documented in great detail in the link provided here. So you can go to this link and review all the settings as needed for the environment. FTS, as we all understand, FTS is the core piece of Smart IT. So reviewing FTS is important. So FTS server performance is very important. There's also a setting for a full text search threshold in the FTS tab of the server information page. By default, this is set to 10,000. You need to make sure this is, set to 2,000 or lower. I mean, we know customers who set it to even 200, depending upon the number of, data that you're interested in. So setting it to higher number means AR has to do a lot more work. If it's set to 10,000, it'll fetch 10,000 records, do all kinds of, memory, all kinds of permission checks, etc. So a lot more work has to be done when the setting is at 10,000. So the lower number will greatly improve the performance. If returning the resources section in Smart Recorder is taking time, if returning the tickets on the ticket console is taking time, you should review this setting. Next thing is the Smart IT server configuration. For Smart IT web app server also, like AR server, you need to make sure you review the resources, which is the memory, disk space, all the obvious ones. Make sure there's enough of that for the Smart IT servers to work well. Review the JVM settings as per the performance tuning recommendations. So we had a customer engagement where, most of the JVM settings were, set up as documented, but there were a few things that wasn't set properly, and changing that made a difference. For example, one of the issues was the verbose logging for the JVM was on, so turning it off made a difference. It's very performance intensive. So here are examples of some of the settings changes that was made for one of the customers. We changed the firm space allocation to meta space. We changed the garbage collection to low-cost GC. Then we added usage of hybrid mode pointer to offset 64-bit overhead and turned off verbose login for garbage collection. And the performance was improved. So the next thing, the next component in the environment is the social piece. So the social configuration is the configuration that is around the social data. So what is social data? Social data is the data that we store in the Mongo DB. So the data like work info, data like some ticket information like broadcast, etc., are stored in MongoDB also. So this data can be shared with other apps, etc. So we call it social data. So whenever you hear somebody call social, so it's basically referring to the data that we store in the Mongo database. So there are various pieces that need to be considered here. Is the social plugin, which is installed on the ITSM, then the Mongo database itself, and the social configuration. Social plugin. Social plugin is a plugin that is installed by the Smart IT User Experience Patch. So the Smart IT installer has two pieces, the User Experience patch that goes on the ITSM server, and then the main Smart IT installer that's installed on the Smart IT server. Smart IT User Experience patch installs the social plugin. The plugin is called the Social Event Manager.jar. You can find it under AR System Plugin Server FND folder. This plugin is responsible for updating the Mongo database. There's also a workflow installed on the ITSM server by the User Experience Patch. And there's also a form called the Social Bridge form, which I mentioned earlier, that is installed on the ITSM server. So this workflow that is installed creates entries in this Social Bridge form whenever new tickets are created in ITSM or whenever work info is added in ITSM to the tickets. So the entries get created in this form. Records in the Social Bridge form are then processed by the social plugin that is installed by the ITSM User Experience Patch. If records are getting stuck here in this Social Bridge form, that can contribute to the slow performance in Smart IT and ITSM. So you need to make sure records are getting processed immediately in this form. So typical issues here with the Social Bridge form, why records could get stuck here are one of the following listed here. Records can get stuck due to configuration issues in the key store form. Key store form is a form installed on the ITSM database also by the Smart IT installer. Here we have a URL for the Smart IT host. This URL may not be correct, right? So if you don't have a correct URL for the Smart IT, it doesn't know where to direct it. Secret and token may not be correct. That can also contribute to the issues with the Social Bridge form. If you have an SSL setup and you don't have valid Smart ID certificate then that can cause an issue, right? You need to have the valid Smart ID certificate on the AR server, security folder, and you also need to have the same certificate on the Smart IT. You could have old records stuck here in the Social Bridge form. These records could be from while you were testing, or it could be while you had some problem. And once you fix the problem, you need to make sure these records are processed, or you should delete them if you don't care for those, records. You need to keep the data in the Social Bridge form lean and clean, right? I mean, whatever is coming in should get processed and move on. You could also, run into a defect with the plugin maybe not picking up some characters in the node that is being transferred over to the social database, right? So you need to keep an eye. If something is getting stuck here, you need to understand why it's getting stuck. There's also social configuration file on the Smart IT server, which you should review for correct Mongo server names and authentication parameters to make sure it's set up correctly. There's also plugin server _config.xml. Haven't typically seen any problems with this. Here the plugin is registered. If it's not correctly registered here, then the plugin may not get loaded. But this is usually updated by the installer, and haven't actually seen an issue with this so far. So mostly been issues with certificates not valid and key store information. If somebody manually messed around with the key store information, then that could be a problem. I mean, key store is also updated by the installer, and it's just but these are the things you can actually kind of review and make sure they're all correct. Here are showing you some of the screenshots of the Social Bridge form when records get stuck here. So this screenshot shows you record getting stuck because of an expired certificate. You need to make sure you have the right certificate. This screenshot shows you a record getting stuck here in processing state. It could be maybe the escalation thread died or something. You can process these records again. You should just put it back in, in a state to reprocess it, and then get these records cleared out. Okay, so another piece in the social configuration is the Mongo database. Mongo database is the database where the social data is stored. If Mongo data is not retrieving fast, you need to Mongo resources are adequate. You should also review a Mongo configuration for the storage, the type of storage is set up with it. We've noticed this issue with one or two customers where, Mongo storage was not set up for WireTiger. With Mongo version 3.2, WireTiger is the default storage engine, whereas with versions less than 3.2, WireTiger needs to be configured. You have the capability to configure the storage to utilize WireTiger storage engine. WireTiger is basically a newer type of storage engine for Mongo, which uses data compression and can do multi-threading when you have multiple CPUs on the server. So it is really helpful from the performance perspective. We've seen data getting compressed to almost 1/6 the size with and without Mongo, right? With WireTiger. This becomes obvious as the data in the Mongo database grows. When you reach a certain threshold, you'll start noticing performance issues if you do not have it set up with the WireTiger storage. Should also review the authentication setup to make sure all the servers are set up correctly. There's also social configuration for Mongo database 3.x. If it is set up with WireTiger storage engine and replica set. Replica set is basically like your, a server group type of environment for Mongo. You can have primary Mongo, secondary Mongo, etc. So there's a configuration file for social on the Smart IT server, which is the config.js file. In this file, you need to make sure you set the read preference to primary. So this is good only if you are using the WireTiger storage engine. And obviously, you should make sure the correct Mongo servers and authentication info is defined in this config.js file. Config.js file has the information about what Mongo servers you're using, authentication information that is used. You should review that and make sure that's all correct, because this is the configuration file that is used for used by Smart IT server to correspond to the Mongo server. OpenFire settings. So OpenFire, as we noticed in the architecture picture earlier, OpenFire is another component in the Smart IT environment. So Smart IT install can install the OpenFire chat, or it can be installed on a separate environment. So you can have the OpenFire on the same server as Smart IT, or it can be on a separate environment in a server group or without the server group. However, we've noticed a lot of customers do not use the chat in Smart IT. So if you're not using the OpenFire chat, you should make sure you disable it completely in the connect.properties. Misconfigured chat can cause client-side performance. Noticed in some customer instances where they had OpenFire disabled on, they had 3 Smart ID servers, so it was disabled on 2 of the servers and not disabled on 1 of the servers. And since OpenFire was not configured in the OpenFire admin console, it was fine. I mean, it wasn't causing any functional issues, but at the client side, you were seeing degradation, whenever the calls were going to this third server, because it's thinking chat is on and then it's just the calls are failing. So there's no functional implication, but it's just extra work that can be avoided if you completely cleanly disable OpenFire if it's not needed in the connect.properties, which is a Smart IT configuration file, can be found on the Smart IT server. So there's a connect.properties on each of these Smart IT servers. The next thing to look into is the integrations to ITSM. Smart IT slowness can be caused by poorly configured ITSM integrations. If the ITSM integration is not configured properly, it can cause slowness. We've had instances where there's an integration pumping in data to ITSM, everything is working fine, and suddenly maybe you're running into a bug in the integration and it's just pumping 10 times the data it needs to, and it's hogging up the resources, causing DB contentions, DB locking, and which causes the environment slowness. So, once you fix the underlying problem, the issue will be resolved, right? So you need to make sure you don't have any poorly configured integrations that are hogging up the resources, or you're not importing large data loads during peak time and making the database busy, So those things should be reviewed to make sure there is enough, resources available during peak hours for users to access the environment. AR query performance. So identify the slow use cases or the long-running queries. So you can have, in Smart IT, you can have certain queries taking time, or you could have people using wildcards in areas and causing long-running queries. You need to identify use cases that are slow, identify queries that are taking long time, because queries that could be hogging up the resources can cause overall slowness. So, so you can use AR API SQL logs to capture the SQL for those queries. You can also get the SQL, at the DB level with the help of your DBA. We have tools like AR Analyzer tools that can help analyze these logs and identify the long-running queries. So you need to make sure those queries are tuned that could be bringing them. So tuning means adding the right indexes, making sure table scans are not happening, identify what is, you can leverage your DBA and run the query directly. Once you identify the long-running queries, you can take the query with the help of your DBA, try and run it at the database directly, identify the cost of the missing index. Okay, if this query is doing a table scan, what is the cost of the missing index? Identify how many reads it's doing to make the query or complete the query. So understanding that is important, because once you identify the index, then you need to rerun to make sure the cost is actually going down, the number of reads are going down, because if those are not improving, then adding the index is really not useful. So, so the point is to make sure if you have any slow running queries or queries that are taking long time, you need to make sure you get to them, identify the root cause, and add the necessary indexes that will help them run faster. So while you are considering adding indexes, will help improve running the query faster, but adding too many indexes can also cause slowness. So you have to be careful when you try to add indexes. When you run the query, database will give you a recommendation of the index. Review the recommendations. Sometimes database gives you way too many fields in the recommended index than are actually needed. So you can always trim down on the number of fields in the index. You'll usually include all the fields in the where clause and maybe also the fields in the select and all that stuff. So in most cases, I've noticed you only need fields that are part of the where. So you can start with that, then add more if the cost is not going down or if the reads are not going down. But yeah, be careful before you add more indexes. You can add temporarily at the database level, run the query again with the index, and see if there is an improvement. Once you notice the index is improving the query runtime and the number of reads, then you can go ahead and add it using the Dev Studio. So adding from the Dev Studio is important because the index will retain even after the upgrade. So make sure you're not adding the index just at from the database, because you may not remain there once you upgrade. Or if you modify the form, the index might get dropped. So the other thing we've noticed in some customer situations, when things are slow, we review a lot of things, including the unused indexes. So be careful with dropping unused indexes, especially if they are out-of-the-box indexes. I mean, it's good to not have overheads if they're not really needed, but we just have to be careful here, because we could have a release coming out in the future that could utilize one of the indexes, and then the query may not perform faster if you dropped one of the out-of-the-box indexes. So social Mongo queries are the other thing that you should be paying attention to. So you could have all the ITSM side of the data now tuned well, and all the queries that go to ITSM, the data is being returned fast enough. So, but there's activity data on the tickets or the update feeds on the dashboard that is not loading fast. So that is the data that is coming from Mongo Database. That is what we refer to as the social data. So if any of this data, the activity data or the update data, seems to be slow, you should review your Mongo environment. It could indicate that your Mongo environment is slow. It could be related to some configuration on the Mongo side. Maybe Mongo resources, we reviewed the ITSM resources or the Smart ID resources. Similarly, you should review the Mongo server resources to make sure they are all up to the mark. You should make sure MongoDB is set up with Tiger storage. You should make sure that config.js for the social is correctly set up. And if you're using Tiger storage, make sure the read preference is set to primary. So those are some of the things that we should pay attention to. Database tuning. So we've looked at, various, all the AR environment. We looked at the Smart IT environment. We looked at the Mongo environment. All of that is tuned. Next thing to pay attention to is the database. If the queries are taking longer at the database level, especially during peak hours, in spite of having all the right indexes, maybe your database is not tuned well. So you need to review your database settings. you need to make sure you have enough buffer and procedure cache. You need to make sure you have enough resources for these. So buffer cache comes into picture if you are dealing with large amounts of data returned by queries. It can fill up the buffer, right? And then if there isn't enough memory, it has to do a lot of swapping back and forth. Not enough procedure cache. When you run a query at the database level, first time when you run a query, it can take longer because it has to do extra work, like it has to generate execution plans for the query. So when you run the query second time, third time, etc., those execution plans, if there is enough procedure cache, can stay in the memory for some time, and subsequent runs are usually faster. That's why, usually when you might have noticed, when you run a certain query second time, third time, it will be faster than the first time because the database remembers certain part of the query and it works faster. But if database is does not have enough resources for the procedure cache, every time it runs the query, it has to do all the work. It has to generate the execution plan. It has to compile the plan and then run the query. So pay attention to that if the queries are performing not as expected. Here are a few settings that are that are important. I mean, there's a lot of database settings that should be considered. There is a complete detailed link in the next slide, in the reference slide that you should refer to. But I've highlighted a few here that should be considered and that we've actually encountered in the field that actually helped with improving the performance of the execution of the query. The degree of parallelism. Based on the number of processors and cores of the database server, query execution can be limited to X number of servers. For example, for Microsoft SQL, usually for servers with less than 8 CPUs, you can, there's a setting called MaxDOP, which is maximum degree of parallelism. It can be set to the number of the CPUs. So you should review this setting. By default, this is the setting on the SQL Server. There's a similar setting for Oracle where you can set the min parallelism and the max parallelism. So these need to be reviewed. It is not like, okay, one setting will work for all. It can vary from environment to environment depending upon the resources. So, for example, on SQL Server, one of the customers, based on their CPU, we set the max stop setting to 8, and there is another component that comes along with it is cost of parallelism to 50, and that's the setting it worked for them. But it was based on their CPUs. They had 8 CPUs, and depending upon the resources. You have to do a trial and error to set the max stop setting. So work with your DBA, review the documentation, and set the parameter correctly to see what is the right threshold for your environment. This will leverage the multiple CPUs on the server properly, right? There's also read committed snapshot is another setting in SQL Server. It should be turned on. It will help with fewer deadlocks and fewer locks for transaction, which will, reduce the overall overhead of the environment. Disk I/O is something else that should also be looked at. Review what kind of storage you have. Stripe disk configuration is recommended over concatenated disks. Flash drives are much faster versus RAID, so understand all of that. So here is a slide with all the useful reference links that you can refer to for looking at all the settings. So there's detailed database settings you can find under the link to AR sizing and performance tuning. You have all the sizing information, how database should be set up, different settings for Oracle database, SQL database, whether it is talking about a maximum degree of parallelism or read committed snapshot, etc. All of that is detailed in great detail in these links, and explained why a certain setting will work the way it's working. You also have the Mongo link, the FTS fortification link, all the Smart IT links with the recommended indexes and other troubleshooting links that will help you improve your tune your environment and improve the performance. So finally, to summarize, we've covered all the use cases that are very common in Smart IT and prone to performance. We've reviewed what all components comprise of Smart IT and what all configurations we should look at. We should make sure we tune the queries. We don't have any long-running queries hogging the resources. We tune the database. And with that, we come to the end of this webinar, and now we're open to Q&A at this point.
Great. Thank you, Seema. And Steve, do you have questions for Seema?
Actually, yeah, I do have several lined up. And before I get to the questions, just want to remind you that if you have a question, you can continue using the Q&A section of the WebEx event to ask your question. And also, if your question does not get answered, it will be addressed once the Q&A gets posted with the recording to the BMC communities. So with that, I'll start off with the first question. How can we avoid a leading percent to be used in the qualification if the user enters a string like %INC 0000201%?
So this one, actually, right now we cannot avoid this. So in the global search field, a user can type in a %string %. So you need to make sure you educate your users at this point of time to not put a leading % on the global search field. We do, however, have an enhancement request in the product where we are considering a configuration that if there is a leading % entered by the user, it will be truncated before using it in the qualification. So if somebody put a string %, we will just get rid of the the leading %.
Thank you. Next question is, in global search, can I access the filter up front to limit the return results?
Actually, yes. So the very first time you cannot, but the second time onwards you can access the filter to limit your searches. So there is a filter that will let you say search only against incidents. Again, we have enhancement in this area where we will have some UI improvement in this area where you can, actually do some of these things up front.
Thank you. Why should the read preference be set to primary Mongo in social config?
Since the secondary servers are in the process of syncing primary servers, they are slow to fetch records from the secondary server. So in MongoDB 3.x, the write operation is at the record level or the row level, instead of at the document level or the table level as was in the MongoDB. So primary server will be most available and faster to fetch the records. Therefore, we suggest to set the read preference to primary with Mongo 3.x and up when you use WireTiger storage.
Perfect, thanks. The next question is, can we limit the searches on Smart Recorder?
We cannot, yeah. Currently, we cannot limit the searches on the Smart Recorder.
Thanks. Is Smart IT Web App available as a standalone WAR file?
Standalone WAR file. When we install a Smart IT, it's not a standalone WAR file. I mean, there is the installer. It installs various components. It installs a bunch of providers under Apache folder. It installs a UX folder. There's a full-fledged installer that installs Smart IT and installs various pieces. There's a bunch of forms that are imported on the ITSM server as well when we run the Smart IT installer.
Okay, thank you. Is fortification supported on Remedy 9.x to also apply indexes, not only to run the reports?
I need to review that. I'm not, it should be, but I'm not very certain. I need to get back and check on that.
Okay, that's fine. We'll get to the next question here. Are there exclude flags for the other fields like serial number?
No, there's only exclude flag for tag number and CIID.
Have there been any improvements / adjustments to the social bridge for CMDB processing? For example, when our recon / normalization jobs run, there are thousands of entries being pushed through social bridge.
So we don't. We do have an option, like if you're doing big loads like UDM loads, we do not sync the data right away. We do not create entries in social bridge. We recommend running on tools like onboarding to onboard that data into social. But for asset stuff, I need to check on that. I don't think we have. I think it does inline syncing with the social.
Okay.
But that's a good suggestion. I think we could look at it as we do for the UDM jobs. I mean, yeah.
Okay, great. I only have 2 more questions, so I just want to remind the attendees that you do have the opportunity to ask your questions via the Q&A section of the webinar event. Next question is, can the storage engine be changed to wired Tiger after the fact / installation?
Yes, you can.
Thanks. And the last question that I have right here is, when a filter is applied in the ticket console, is a search performed only in the AR server database or in MongoDB as well?
Only in the AR system database. It goes and searches against the union view. We talked about SHR union overview console form, which has the database views underneath it. So it goes to, which is the AR system database.
All right, I guess we'll just pause just for a moment to see if there's any last questions that we can ask live. Here's one question. Does ITSM performance impact Smart IT performance?
Yes. Yes, that ITSM Smart IT it's almost like a UI on top of ITSM, right? So if ITSM is slow, yeah, you should not even look at Smart IT. You should first fix ITSM. ITSM AR performance is very core to Smart IT.
All right, why don't we make this the last call for questions? I'll go ahead and pause a moment, and then if there are no further questions, I'll turn it back over to you, Greg. So hold on. Here's a question. It says, regarding the Smart IT WAR file, we would like to set up the components separate and have own Tomcat hosting services available, including monitoring. Are all installer components necessary?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Steve, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I will repeat it. Regarding the Smart IT WAR file, We would like to set up the components separate and have our have own Tomcat hosting services available, including monitoring. Are all installer components necessary?
For Smart IT, yes, yeah. I mean, we only install whatever is necessary for Smart IT to work, right? So it's almost like we have to break the installation into different components to understand what all is installed. So yeah, I would recommend using the installer and then, figuring out, okay, what monitoring services you need to install along with it to monitor Smart IT. But yeah, I would not go the other route.
All right, great. Well, that was our final question. So, Greg, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Seema, for a great presentation and all the panelists that help answer the questions. For contacting BMC, it's available via all the social channels, as well as to contact BMC technical support are listed here. Want to thank you all for participating in our monthly Connect with Remedy webinar series. The final video recording, clickable links, and the Q&A will be published within a week of today's live presentation. That concludes this month's webinar. Thank you.